I used to be a medical doctor, and I was a paediatrician in fact, and that's relevant to how I first became interested in climate justice. I can distinctly remember, to be honest, being a little bit sceptical about climate issues, and then I was in a church one Sunday morning and there was a video being shown about climate issues, and initially I wasn't really interested very much. But then as this video continued, it showed me something that I hadn't realised until that point, which is that climate change, global warming, impacts people, and in particular impacts the poor. The reason I think people should be engaged in issues of climate justice is fundamentally because it's about people. And actually the Old Testament put that in concrete terms. It said things like, when you're building a house, put a parapet around the roof so that people don't fall off. It said if your neighbour's ox or donkey falls by the wayside, you should help it and pick it up and bring it back to your neighbour. It said you should leave gleanings, food at the edge of the field, or crops at the edge of the field so your neighbour can pick them up. My point is, the Old Testament is full of a narrative of a command that says we need to care for our neighbour. Now that's continued into the New Testament. Paul says we shouldn't only look out for our own interests. John says, or in the letter to John, it says, how can the love of God be in us if we simply say to the person who's hungry and homeless, bless you and we'll pray for you, but do nothing to meet their physical needs. Climate change, global warming, affects people. It affects, in particular, poor people. Heat waves, through droughts, through crop failures, through floods, extreme weather events, through rise in communicable diseases, through insect-borne diseases that are going to grow in their spread of pattern. And those people are our brothers and sisters. So how do we address this? Well, I absolutely think the way we address this is by getting involved in political engagement. Okay, ultimately the solution to climate change is going to be a multinational or international political solution. That's where it has to come from. Now, we can't influence, or not easily, the United Nations, but we can influence the British government. We can influence the British government through how we vote. We can influence the British government through the policies that we support, through writing and meeting with our local MP for campaigning on issues of climate justice here in the UK. So thinking about Romans 13, it says be subject to the authorities, and some people have interpreted that to mean that we just do whatever governments say. Governments have been appointed by God, and therefore we should just obey them. But actually, if you look at the life of Paul, indeed if you look at the life of Jesus and the early disciples, there's times when they very clearly are not, don't just do whatever the authorities say. So you have this tension. Governments ordained by God. In some sense, we're meant to be subject to them, but also examples where we're clearly, in the name of Christ, not simply doing everything that the authorities are saying. Governments are ordained by God, but they're ordained by God as a temporary measure until Christ comes again. And while they have this temporary authority, what is it that Christians are meant to do? They're meant to hold those governments to account. British evangelicalism has a great history of political engagement. Obviously I can point to the 19th and 18th centuries and the reforms of people like Wilberforce and Elizabeth Fry and so on. Evangelicals are right at the forefront of changing school systems, penal systems. Slavery obviously is the classic example that everyone knows about, but factory conditions as well, the lives of the working poor, children's rights and so on. So if we look at our heritage as evangelicals, we have been, certainly in the 19th and 18th centuries, very much engaged in political reform. Jubilee 2000, a campaign that was begun by Christians about cancelling third world debt, it actually led to the cancellation of global south debt and the introduction of the highly indebted poor countries initiative. In other words, it's made a real difference yes, these problems are big and complex. Yes, we're not going to solve them, and some of them will remain, until Jesus comes again. But we need to do what we can, because that's what it means to love our neighbour in the meantime. And certainly my experience of political engagement has been that those who genuinely have the biggest influence are those who do it quietly. The media aren't going to point to those conversations. They took place quietly, they took place in the background, but actually they've had a bigger influence in changing policy. And to use a biblical analogy, perhaps you could argue working more as a mustard seed that actually leads to much bigger change in the long term.